Red dust boils up off a gravel road in the September heat, and a truck comes fast toward a farm that should not exist. From the sky, the land tells a lie. The man behind the wheel is about to catch 12 dead acres, remembered wrong. The truck slows at a white fence. Boots hit the ground, clean boots, a pressed collar, a clipboard held like a weapon. He came to reclaim something. He came expecting a mess, a smell, a tired old woman with a complaint. Instead, green pasture running to the tree line, 60 head of cattle heavy and gleaming, barns that were never there before. And at the gate, one small hand resting on the top rail, a girl of 14 who is not surprised to see him. Who has been waiting? She does not look away, neither does he. Somewhere behind that stillness, 2 years of something is about to speak. The truck came up this gravel drive on a Tuesday morning in late September, dragging a long red plume of Oklahoma dust behind it like something reluctant to let go. Garrett Thorne stepped out in clean boots and a collar that had never once known honest sweat, holding a clipboard against his hip, the way a man holds a thing he intends to use. He had been summoned to the Ashford property, and if he was honest with himself, he had come expecting a fight. 2 years of spent brewery grain heaped along that sagging fence line. 2 years of a small monthly check going out to some widow he had never bothered to meet, and now a letter asking him to come see the land for himself. He assumed it was a complaint dressed up in polite handwriting. He assumed there would be a smell, a mess, a demand for more money. What he had not assumed was any of what now stood in front of him. Pasture rolled out past the gate in a green so deep it looked painted, stretching toward a tree line he could barely make out in the morning haze. Cattle grazed across it, dozens of them, heavy through the shoulders, glossy in the low light. The kind of animals a man drives past on the good highways and thinks belong to somebody with real money. A row of white barns stood clean against the sky, their metal roofs catching the sun. Workers moved between them without hurry, unloading, measuring, doing the small, competent things that only happen on a place that runs well. And at the gate, one hand resting on the top rail, stood a girl of 14 who did not look the least bit surprised to see him. She was not angry. She was not nervous. She had the still settled look of a person who had rehearsed this meeting 100 times in her head and found that the real thing was quieter than she expected. Garrett laughed a short, awkward sound because that is what men like him do when the ground shifts under them. His eyes went past her to the operation, to the certificates he could see framed on a shed wall, to the fat animals and the tidy fences. So all of this, he managed, gesturing with the clipboard, this came off the grain we dropped. The girl looked at him without blinking. Wren Ashford had a way of holding a person's gaze that made grown men feel they had been measured and filed away. I didn't ask you here because of the grain, she told him, her voice even carrying no heat at all. I asked you here so you'd see what it turned into. Garrett stopped laughing. To understand the thing he was standing in the middle of, you have to go back. You have to travel to a very different version of this land, and to a beginning that nobody, least of all Garrett Thorne, would have bet a single dollar on. 2 years earlier, the Ashford place in Muskogee County looked like something the century had left behind. The fields were dry and blotch-patched with bald red earth where the grass had given up entirely. The fences leaned at the post wire, slack between them, held together in places with baling twine and stubbornness. The farmhouse had been white once a long time ago, but the paint had chalked and peeled until the whole structure had settled into the gray of an old man's Sunday shirt washed too many times. Everything about the property carried the particular exhaustion of land that had been asked to give more than it had for far too long. Inside that house, at a kitchen table with one short leg propped on a folded matchbook, sat Della Ashford. 64 years old, widowed 9 winters, built lean and hard. The way fence posts are built, she had spent the better part of 4 decades wringing a living out of 12 acres that seemed to resent the effort. She kept the place going on a Social Security check that arrived on the 3rd of every month and whatever the hens decided to give her. And most mornings that arithmetic sat on her chest before she even got her boots on. The arithmetic was the enemy she knew best. She did it in pencil because pencil could be erased and tried again, though the answer never softened, no matter how many times she reworked it. Feed on one line, the propane man on another. The note the bank held against the back 40 small enough that they had never come for it and large enough that it never left her thoughts. She had learned to carry the numbers the way a person learns to carry an old injury, favoring it without complaint, forgetting some days that it was there until she reached the wrong way and felt it flare. Wren had come to live with her 4 years back when the girl was 9, and her mother's long illness had made the raising of a child impossible. Della had not hesitated. She had driven the 200 miles herself, brought the girl home in the passenger seat of a truck that smelled of oil and old hay, and set a place for her at the table that same night without any speech about it. That was Della's way. She did not narrate her kindnesses. She simply performed them and moved on. And if you wanted to thank her, you did it by not making a fuss. The girl was 13 then, and she understood the word struggle the way other children her age understood the word vacation. She rose before the school bus to scatter feed for the flock and checked that the ice had not sealed the water trough. She came home in the afternoons and walked the lines looking for the small failures that became big ones if you ignored them, a gap in the wire where a calf could push through a slow leak, darkening the ground under a spigot. She did not complain. Not when her boots leaked, not when the other kids had things she did not once. But no amount of a child's willingness could put minerals back in soil that had none, and the land was tired in a way that willingness could not fix. The topsoil had thinned to almost nothing. The hens had slowed their laying, and every month the figures refused to become anything but a warning. They needed something. Neither of them could have told you what. They only knew the shape of the hole, not the thing that might fill it. The Copperline Brewing Company sat about a mile east of the Ashford fence, a mid-sized regional outfit that had been turning barley into beer since the middle of the 1980s. Nobody in the county gave much thought to what became of the grain once the good part had been boiled out of it. As it happened, most of it ended up in a heap somewhere, because that is the quiet truth of brewing. Spent grain, the sodden leftover mash of barley and wheat and oats that remains after the sugars are drawn off, is one of the most abundant leftovers in American agriculture. Every 100 pounds of beer leaves behind roughly 30 pounds of the wet stuff warm from fermentation, dense with protein and fiber, and turning fast to a problem the moment you run out of a plan for it. Copperline's plan was the cheapest one available. Pay a handful of nearby landowners a token fee to let the trucks dump along their fence lines and drive away clean. Della's arrangement came to $30 a week. $30 was a tank of gas and part of a grocery run. She had said yes without needing to think it over, and she had signed the 2 pages they handed her without reading past the number. Because when you are drowning, you do not audit the rope. The first load arrived on a Wednesday, backed up to the fence, and tipped out in a steaming mound before the driver so much as looked at the house. By Friday, Wren could catch the smell of it from the porch, a thick, sweetish sourness that rode in on the evening air and settled into everything. The curtains, the wash on the line, the inside of her own nose until she stopped noticing it and then noticed it again. She walked down to the fence and stood there a long while studying the pile, its surface faintly moving in the heat of its own slow rot. Most people would have seen garbage and turned around. Most people would have held their sleeve to their nose and gone back inside. Wren did not turn around. She looked and she kept looking, and something in the back of her mind filed the moment away for reasons she could not yet name. The pile did not disgust her the way it disgusted her grandmother. It interested her the way a locked door interests a child who suspects there is a room behind it. It began as the important things on a farm often do with the chickens. About 3 weeks after that first load, Wren noticed the hens had changed their habits. They had always kept close to the coop, scratching the same tired ground they scratched every day of their lives. Now they were drifting east toward the fence, gathering in a loose, restless knot near the base of the grain pile. Not into it, but near it, working the dirt with a fresh and deliberate energy she had never seen in them. She stood at the edge of the yard and watched them do it 3 afternoons running, and by the 3rd afternoon she knew this was not a thing to shrug off. Chickens did nothing on purpose that did not pay them. Whatever was drawing them, it was food, and food coming up out of ground that had been dead was a thing worth understanding. Then she saw the worms. They came up through the soil in the runoff zone, where the grain's moisture had been soaking down for weeks. More earthworms than she had ever seen gathered in one patch of ground in her life, threading fat and pink through dirt that had been dead red clay since before she was born. She crouched and pressed her fingers into that ground, and it gave. It crumbled dark and loose and cool, where a foot away it was still packed hard as a road. The difference was not her imagination. The difference was under her hand, a line she could feel with her fingertips, dead earth on one side and living earth on the other. and the only thing that had crossed between them was the runoff from a pile everyone called waste. She said nothing to her grandmother. Not yet. She was not a girl who ran to announce a thing she did not understand. She simply started watching more closely, and she started thinking and thinking, and Wren Ashford had a way of turning into work. She was not a talkative child, but she was a reading one, ravenous and undirected. On 3 consecutive Saturdays, she rode her bicycle the 4 miles into town to the Muskogee County Library and came home each time with the wire basket loaded down. Agricultural extension bulletins with government seals on the covers. Livestock nutrition guides thick as bricks. Back issues of a farming magazine curled at the corners from other people's hands. She borrowed a soil science textbook from her science teacher, a stooped, patient man named Mr. Alderman who raised one eyebrow at the request and handed it across without asking a single question, which was its own quiet kindness. He did ask her weeks later whether the book had been of any use, and she told him it had, and he nodded as though a private theory of his had been confirmed and said nothing more. She learned that spent brewery grain carried as much as 25% crude protein by dry weight, a richer feed than most of what came bagged and branded from the co-op. She learned its heavy fiber steadied the digestion of cattle and other animals that chewed their cud. She learned that worked into the ground with care, it woke up the invisible life in the soil, the bacteria and the fungi that turned dead dirt back into something that could grow. She read until the words swam, and then she read a little more. The magazines used words she had to look up, and she looked them up, and the looking up became its own habit. One word opening onto 3 others until an afternoon disappeared, and she surfaced blinking with a page of terms she had not known that morning. She started a notebook. The cover was blue, a plain school composition book, and she wrote her name inside the front flap in careful letters. Into it went every observation, every measurement she could make with a ruler and a coffee can, every question she could not yet answer. She sat at the kitchen table long after Della had gone to bed, a flashlight tented under the crook of her arm, reading about the biology of fermentation, while the house ticked and settled around her. Nobody had assigned any of it. Nobody was watching. She did it because the questions would not leave her alone, and because somewhere in her, the suspicion had taken root that the steaming pile at the fence was not waste at all, but a thing that only looked like waste to people who had stopped paying attention. That was the first turning, though she would not have called it one. It was only a thought sitting alone at a dark table. But it was the thought that everything else grew out of, and years later she would understand that the whole of it, the barns and the cattle and the man with the clipboard, all traced back to a single stubborn refusal to look away from something that smelled bad. Her first real attempt to do something with what she had learned lasted 11 days before it came apart in her hands. She gathered spent grain in 5-gallon buckets, hauling them up from the fence 2 at a time, until her shoulders burned and her palms wore red where the wire handles cut in. She spread it in the afternoon sun to dry, or tried to, and mixed the partly dried mash with cracked corn and the vegetable scraps from the kitchen, working up a supplement she meant to feed the flock. The hens took to it eagerly enough at first, crowding the trough, shouldering one another aside. And for a few days she let herself believe she had cracked it on the first swing. She wrote hopeful things in the notebook those days, things she would later cross out. Then the real heat of Indian summer came down like a hand, and the grain she had not dried through began to turn. It molded fast and it molded ugly, a gray fur spreading across the surface overnight, and the sour smell of it went from unpleasant to something that turned the stomach. 2 of her best layers went off their feed. A third grew listless, standing hunched in the corner of the run, with her feathers puffed and her eyes half shut. The reek near the feeding station brought Della out of the house with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a line Wren knew well. Her grandmother stood at the gate and took in the moldering trough the sick hen, the girl standing guilty in the middle of it. "Wren," she said, and the single word carried the whole question. "What exactly is it you're trying to do out here?" Wren did not look away, though everything in her wanted to. "I made a mistake," she answered, and her voice was quiet, but it did not shake. That was all. She did not cry. She did not make excuses. She carried the fouled feed off to the compost and scrubbed the trough with lye soap and cold water until her hands ached, and she moved the sick hen to a pen of her own where she could watch it, and over the next 3 days she nursed it back with clean mash and boiled water, and it lived. And she counted that a lesson bought cheap. Then she went inside and she opened the blue notebook, and by the light of the flashlight, She wrote down exactly what had gone wrong in the plainest words she had. Too much moisture in the mix. Mold takes hold within 3 days in this heat. Test small batches first. Watch the animals before trusting anything. She underlined the last line twice. A failure that gets written down is not the same as a failure that gets mourned, and Wren had already begun to understand the difference. She was learning in a way that most people never learn at any age, that the notebook did not care whether she was embarrassed. It only cared whether she told it the truth. She started over. Word travels in a small county the way water finds the low ground, and Muskogee County was no different. By the tail of spring, half the district had heard that the Ashford girl was out there trying to raise livestock on beer garbage, and the hearing of it produced exactly the response you would expect. Cyrus Deal, who farmed the quarter section 2 fields over and considered himself the ranking authority on nearly every subject a man could name, said his piece loud enough at the feed store counter that it carried out to the loading dock. Building her whole future out of brewery slop, he announced to no one and everyone, shaking his head with the satisfaction of a man confirming his own low expectations. That whole family's always been a little bit touched, you ask me. Nobody had asked him. It made no difference. The word went out and it came back around the way such words do to the girl. It was about carried by children who had heard their fathers repeat it. The children at school were no gentler in the way that children sharpen a thing until it draws blood. Somebody landed on Barley Girl and it stuck to her for a good long while, followed her down the hallways and out to the bus in a sing-song that was meant to make her flinch. Wren heard every syllable of it. She let it land and she let it sit, and she did not give the satisfaction of a reaction, because she had already worked out that a reaction was the only currency that kind of talk traded in. She rode the bus home and she fed the animals and she opened the notebook, and the notebook did not know or care what anyone had called her. There was a freedom in that she came to prize a plot of ground where no name anyone gave her could follow. By the deep of summer, the signs were quiet, but they were no longer deniable. The 3 head of beef cattle Della had kept for years out of habit, more than hope thin. Sorry animals that had never amounted to much were carrying weight along their backs and ribs for the first time in memory. Their coats had gone from dull to sleek. Their eyes had brightened. The monthly feed bill that number Della carried like a stone had dropped by nearly a third. The hens had settled back into steady laying, and the eggs came richer now, the yolks a deep orange, the shells thick enough to resist a careless thumb. And in the small square of ground near the south fence, where Wren had turned finished grain compost into the soil by hand, the grass had come up greener than anywhere else on the 12 acres. Not by a dramatic margin, just enough that the eye caught it and held. One evening she told her grandmother, in the flat, careful way she reported everything, "I think it's actually working." Della set down her coffee and looked at the girl across the kitchen for a long moment, the kind of look that takes a full accounting of a person. "I know it is," she said, and that was as close to celebration as the 2 of them came, which was close enough. Later that night, Della stood at the window a long time looking out at the dark shapes of the cattle, and Wren, passing in the hall, saw her there and did not disturb her. Understanding without being told that her grandmother was doing a different kind of arithmetic, now one where the numbers had finally begun to move the right way. It was around then that a truck neither of them recognized turned in off the county road. The man who climbed out of it was in his 50s, unhurried, with the sunburned forearms and the seen-everything eyes of someone who had spent his whole working life among small farms and the people who broke themselves on them. Dr. Ellis Ward was an extension agent out of the State University's regional office, and he had not come for Wren at all. He had come chasing a soil erosion report from a neighboring parcel, and the Ashford place simply lay on his way back to the highway. He was nearly done, one boot already up on the running board of his truck, when the girl came across the yard and asked plainly whether he would take a minute to look at something. He almost said no. It had been a long day, and he had a longer drive, and small farms were full of people wanting a free minute of a state man's time. But there was something in how she asked, no pleading in it, only a flat confidence that what she had was worth the minute, and he found himself stepping back down. She put the blue notebook in his hands. He stood in the field a long time with it, longer than she expected. Turning back through the pages, his eyes moving from her cramped handwriting to the fat cattle, to the dark, crumbling soil at the base of the fence, and then finally to her. "You worked most of this out on your own," he said, and it was not quite a question. "Books helped," she answered. Ellis Ward explained then to the girl and to Della, who had come down off the porch to stand at the edge of the conversation with her arms folded, that what this child had built in a blue composition book was a rough but genuinely working system, the kind of thing he had watched trained programs fail to teach grown men. The spent grain was doing two jobs at once. It was feeding the livestock as a high-protein supplement that cut the feed bill to the bone, and the runoff and the composted portion were quietly rebuilding the biological life of ground everyone had written off as finished. He told them he had seen this concept taught badly in classrooms, full of adults who forgot it by the parking lot. He told them the girl had arrived at it on her own, by watching, by failing, by writing it down, and that the writing down was the rarest part, the part he could not teach anyone to care about. Then he did the thing that mattered most, the thing that told Della more about the man than any of his credentials. He offered to point Wren toward a few resources, a contact or two, a better way to run her moisture tests, a cheap kit for reading what was in soil and water. And then he stepped back. He did not take the notebook home. He did not offer to run the operation or to put his name on it. He left the pencil in the girl's hand because he understood that it was her pencil and that the whole point of the thing was that it always had been. "The land will tell you the truth," he said before he left, folding himself back into the truck. "Most people just never bother to ask it a question." Wren wrote that down too in the back of the notebook in the section she had started keeping for lines that seemed worth more than the moment that produced them. She walked him to his truck and watched him pull out onto the county road, and for the first time she let herself feel something she had been careful not to feel, which was the possibility that this was real, that it was hers, and that it might actually go somewhere. She stood there until the dust settled, turning the feeling over, testing whether it would hold weight. That feeling did not last the week. Della had gone to town for the third of the month errands, and Wren, hunting for a jar of nails in the kitchen drawer where such things migrated, came instead upon the folded arrangement Copperline had sent when the dumping first began. It was 2 pages single-spaced, the language dense and gray, the way such language always is. She had no reason to read it. She read it anyway because reading things she had no reason to read was the entire engine of her, and she was 3/4 of the way down the second page when a single clause caught in her like a hook. The company reserved the right upon 30 days written notice to reclaim access to and use of the fence line easement strip and to redirect all grain deliveries elsewhere at its sole discretion for any reason or for none. She read it a second time to be sure she had it right. She read it a third time, slowly mouthing the harder words until the meaning of it settled all the way down and lay there cold. The whole of it, the fat cattle and the recovering soil and the dark, crumbling ground that had begun to come back to life, every bit of it stood on grain that was not hers. Arriving on land she did not own the use of, by the grace of a company that could take both away with a single sheet of paper and no explanation owed to anyone. The system she had built with 2 years of failure and flashlight nights was on paper borrowed, and borrowed things get called back. She thought of the sick hens she had nursed, of the palms the buckets had blistered of. Every night she had traded sleep for a page of numbers, and she understood that none of it had ever belonged to her the way she had let herself believe. It had belonged to a clause. She did not tell Della when the truck rolled back up the drive with the groceries. Some fears you carry alone a while to see if you can find the bottom of them before you make someone else stand at the edge. She sat at the kitchen table in the last of the daylight, and she opened the blue notebook to a fresh page, and above the moisture ratios and the feeding weights and the careful small victories, she wrote a single line and underlined it once harder than she needed to. "They can end this any time they want. I have to make it so they don't want to." Outside, the last of the light went out of the pasture, and the cattle that were not truly hers moved slow and heavy through grass that had not been hers either. On ground she had brought back from the dead with her own 2 hands, and somewhere east of the fence, a company that had never once looked at what it was. Throwing away went on, throwing it away, not knowing that a girl at a crooked kitchen table had just decided quietly and without a trace of doubt to make herself impossible to get rid of. The starting over was slower than the failing had been, because failing is fast, and getting it right is patient work. Wren rebuilt her drying method from nothing, laying the spent grain out in thin sheets on old window screens. She scavenged from behind the equipment shed, turning it twice a day so the Oklahoma sun could pull the moisture out before the rot could take hold. She kept a coffee can and a kitchen scale weighing the wet grain against the dried, filling page after page of the blue notebook with ratios until the numbers stopped being guesses and became something she could trust. Where the first attempt had been a hope thrown at a problem, This was a method built one careful measurement at a time. She learned to read the grain by feel. Too wet, and it clumped cold in her fist, holding the shape of her fingers like clay. Dried right, it broke apart clean and smelled faintly of bread instead of sourness. She learned the animals told her more than any chart could, that a hen off her feed was a warning worth a week of caution, that a steer that came eager to the trough was a vote of confidence she could bank on. The notebook filled with these small truths, and the flashlight night stretched longer because the more she understood, the more there was to understand. She started dating everything, not because anyone had told her to, but because a thing without a date was a thing she could not compare to the thing before it, and comparison was the whole of what she was doing. April drier than March. This batch turned in 4 days that 1 in 3. She was building without the words for it, a record that would one day matter more than any yield she logged. The mockery did not stop just because the method improved. If anything, it sharpened, because a family failing quietly is easy to pity, and a girl succeeding stubbornly is harder to forgive. Cyrus Deal made a second career of it at the feed store, and he found a fresh audience every week. "Still playing in the beer slop over there," he announced one Saturday loud across the loading dock when Wren happened to be loading a sack of cracked corn into the bed of Della's truck. "Reckon she'll be selling barley perfume next. Bottle it up, sell it to the tourists." The men around him laughed the easy laugh of people who have nothing riding on being wrong. Wren finished loading the sack before she looked at him. She did not raise her voice, which was its own kind of answer. "The cattle don't know they're supposed to be a joke," she told him, settling the tailgate. "They just keep gaining." It was not much of a comeback, but it was true, and truth has a way of ending a conversation that cleverness cannot. Deal's grin thinned. The men found somewhere else to look. That evening she wrote it in the notebook, not the exchange but the lesson underneath it. A man who's already decided how your story ends won't read the pages you're actually writing. She did not know yet how thoroughly Cyrus Deal would prove her right, or how a version of that same idea would come back to matter more than she could guess. She only knew that it steadied her to name the thing, to set it on a page where she could look at it, and that a truth written down stopped being something done to her and became something she understood. The signs of what she was building grew harder to dismiss through that second spring. The 3 head of cattle had become 6 the extra bought cheap from a neighbor who was giving up and glad to be rid of them, and all 6 carried the sleek, heavy look of animals eating better than their owner could rightly afford. Della stopped doing the monthly arithmetic that had bent her shoulders for a decade, not because the money had become easy, but because the feed line of the ledger had simply gone quiet, the grain doing the work that cash used to do. There is a particular relief in watching a number you dreaded stop mattering, and Della felt it settle into her like warmth into cold hands. She caught herself more than once standing straighter than she had in years, and each time she noticed it, she looked over at the girl bent to some task and understood exactly where the change had come from. It was Ellis Ward who put the dangerous word to it, the word that turned a survival trick into an ambition. He came back through in early summer, unbidden this time, curiosity having gotten the better of him, and he walked the fence line with Wren while she showed him the composted strip where the grass now stood knee-high on ground that 2 years back would not have grown a weed. He crouched, worked a handful of the dark earth between his fingers, smelled it the way a man smells good coffee. "You know what you've got here," he said, not quite looking at her. "This isn't just feed anymore. This is a product, what you're making other farms would pay for. Both halves of it, the mix and the method." Wren had felt the edge of that thought before, but had never let herself stand fully on it. Hearing it said out loud by a man who had spent 30 years around failing farms did something to the shape of the future in her mind. "People throw this away," she said slowly, turning the idea over. "They pay to have it hauled off. It's the most valuable thing on the property, and everybody treats it like a problem." The realization landed with the quiet force of something true. The whole county had been standing on gold and calling it garbage, and the only difference between her and them was that she had bothered to look down. That was the turn that changed her aim. Up to then, she had been trying to keep a small farm alive. Now she began cautiously to think about building something. She started keeping a second set of records cleaner than the notebook, the kind of records a person keeps when they might one day need to show a stranger that the thing they claim is real. She wrote these ones in ink in her best hand dates, squared and legible. and she kept them in the folder in a drawer where the damp could not reach them. She approached the neighbor whose failing cattle she had bought and asked plainly whether he would try a sack of her feed mix on the animals he had left. He agreed mostly to be kind. 3 weeks later, he came back asking to buy more, and this time there was no kindness in it, only the plain arithmetic of a man who had seen his stock improve. She had her first customer, and she had gotten him not with charm, but with results, which was the only kind of getting she trusted. She was 14 now, though the birthday had passed without much ceremony. A cake Della made from a boxed mix in a single afternoon off from the animals. The operation had a shape to it that a stranger driving past might have started to notice two customers where there had been none cattle, where there had been a scattering, a strip of green along the south fence that stood out against the tired land like a promise being kept. Wren allowed herself in those weeks a thing close to confidence. She let herself sketch the next year in the back of the notebook more acres of mixing station instead of window screens a second barn. She was learning that a person could plan. Then the letter came and everything she had feared from that folded contract stopped being a fear and became a fact. It arrived on a Thursday in a business envelope with the Copperline logo in the corner addressed to Della, but concerning all of it. Wren read it standing at the mailbox, the county road shimmering with heat behind her, and the ground seemed to tilt a little under her boots. The language was polite in the way a closing door is polite. Copperline Brewing Company was writing to provide the 30 days written notice specified in their agreement. Effective at the end of that period, grain deliveries to the Ashford easement would cease. The company had entered into an arrangement with a regional agricultural firm to redirect its spent grain and would additionally be reclaiming use of the fence line strip as the contract permitted. 30 days. After that, the grain that fed 6 head of cattle and 2 paying customers worth of feed mix would simply stop coming rerouted to some larger operation that had offered Copperline a better deal for the very thing they had been paying Della to take away. The joke of it was almost too bitter to hold. They had discovered right when Wren had that the waste was worth something, and the moment it had value, they wanted it back. She stood at the mailbox a long time, the heat coming up off the road in waves, reading the polite words again, and feeling the sketch she had made in the back of the notebook curl and blacken at the edges. She did not tell Della at the mailbox. She walked the letter up to the house and set it on the kitchen table and let her grandmother read it herself because some blows should not be softened by secondhand telling. Della read it twice the way she read everything that frightened her jaw working slightly. When she set it down, her hands were not quite steady. Well, she said the single word carrying 40 years of blows absorbed and outlasted. They waited till it was worth stealing. But the steadiness Della had worn through every hard season had a crack in it this time because this was not weather or bad luck. This was a decision made by a man in an office who had looked at a widow and a child and seen only a clause he could exercise. That evening, Wren found her grandmother sitting on the porch in the dark, not rocking, just sitting, staring out at the cattle she could barely see. "I've lost things before," Della said without turning. "Your grandfather. The good years. But I never had to watch somebody take a thing while it was still growing. That's a different kind of hurt." The words came out flat, worn smooth, but underneath them was the sound of a woman who had finally reached the end of what she believed she could stand. Wren stood in the doorway a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle onto her own shoulders. Feeling the thing she had built begin to feel less like an accomplishment and more like a target. She could have let it break her the way it was breaking her grandmother. She felt for one honest moment the pull of it, how much easier it would be to simply grieve to be a girl who had tried a hard thing and lost. Instead, something in her went cold and clear, the way it had gone the night she read the contract clause and swore she would not be discarded. She had one thing Copperline did not know. She had one thing no letter could reclaim. She had 2 years of the notebook. She carried the notebook to the kitchen table that night and did something she had never done with it before. She stopped reading it as a record of what she had built and started reading it as evidence page by page, the way a stranger might. 2 years of dated entries, rainfall noted in the margins, soil color logged by the south fence, the north pasture, the runoff zone below the grain pile, water she had scooped from the little creek that cut the property's east edge, tested with the cheap kits Ellis Ward had pointed her toward the readings written down, not because they mattered to her feed mix, but because she wrote down everything. She had been keeping a diary of the land without knowing that a diary of the land was exactly the thing that could save it. She found Ellis Ward's number in the back flap where she had copied it, and she called him the next morning before school, standing in the kitchen with the cord stretched tight. She did not ask him to fight for her. She asked him a question. If a brewery was dumping grain somewhere, it shouldn't somewhere near water. She said, careful and level. What would that look like in the soil? In the creek. Would it show up in numbers a person had been keeping for 2 years without knowing what they were looking at? There was a silence on the line long enough that she thought the call had dropped. When Ward spoke again, his voice had changed, the easy warmth gone tight with attention. It would show up as a nitrogen spike, he said slowly. Oxygen crashing in the water downstream. A pH swing you couldn't explain any other way. Wren, why are you asking me this? She was not asking idly. Something had been turning at the edge of her mind since the letter came, a memory of the trucks. Copperline had been dumping on her fence line, yes, but she had seen their trucks on the county road plenty of times when they had no business near the Ashford place running east toward the low ground, where the creek pooled before it crossed onto the old culvert flats nobody farmed because they flooded. She had assumed nothing of it. Trucks went where trucks went. Now she pulled the notebook toward her and began to hunt backward through her own handwriting, and what she found made her sit down hard in the kitchen chair. The creek readings from the previous 2 springs. She had logged them because a good record keeper logs everything, never once connecting them to anything. A nitrogen reading in April of the first year that she had marked with a small question mark, because it seemed high and she hadn't understood why. Oxygen numbers from the downstream pool that dropped to almost nothing for 3 weeks each spring, exactly when the runoff was heaviest, then recovered. A smell she had noted in the margin, sour and familiar, the same sweetish rot she knew from the grain pile, rising off water a quarter mile from where any grain was supposed to be. She had written it all down and understood none of it because she had been a girl studying feed, not a girl building a case. She was building a case now. She spread the pages out under the kitchen light and saw the pattern the way you see a face in a tangle of branches once someone points to it, unable afterward to unsee it. The spikes came in spring. The trucks came in spring. The pooled water at the culvert flats went sour in spring. 3 facts she had recorded separately across 2 years in the plain and curious hand of a child, logging weather, and laid side by side, they told one story and only one. I think they've been dumping the excess in the creek flats, she told Ward, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. The grain they couldn't sell or spread. I think they've been doing it for 2 years, and I think I have it written down. The line went quiet again, and then Ellis Ward said the thing that turned a frightened girl into a dangerous one. If that's true, and if your dates hold up, that's not a neighbor dispute. That's a violation of state water quality law. That's the kind of thing an agency has to act on. He paused. But Wren, those records have to be clean. Every date, every reading. One sloppy entry in a company lawyer makes the whole book disappear. She looked down at 2 years of flashlight nights at the careful dated entries she had made because she did not know how to be careless at the moisture ratios and the failure she had underlined twice and the line she had copied about the land, telling the truth to anyone who bothered to ask it a question. She had kept the notebook honest for no reason at all, except that honesty was the only way she knew to keep it. Now that reasonless honesty was the one thing standing between her grandmother and ruin. It's clean, she said. I never once wrote down something that wasn't true. I didn't know how to. The days that followed were not quiet. Wren did not sleep much, cross-checking every creek reading against the rainfall logs, building a timeline that a stranger could follow, copying the relevant pages by hand into the cleaner second record, so nothing depended on a single fragile book. She checked her own dates against things she could prove from the outside, a hard freeze. The paper had reported a flood that had closed the county road, anchoring her private record to public facts so that no one could call it invented after the fact. Della watched her work with a mixture of fear and a dawning careful pride because she had raised a girl who met a closing door by studying the hinges. You're sure about this, Della said one night, not quite a question. Once you take a thing like this to the county, you don't get to take it back. A man like that Thorne, he'll come at us with everything. Wren did not look up from the pages. He already came at us with everything, she answered. He just did it politely in a letter, thinking we'd be too small to do anything but fold. The only thing I'm changing is whether he's right. It was the longest speech she had made in weeks, and Della heard in it something that had not been there 2 years ago, a steadiness that was no longer borrowed from anybody. The girl who had once written down her failures in the dark had become a young woman who understood that a record kept in good faith is a kind of power, and that power, once you have it, asks to be used. The clock was against her in a way it had never been. The 30-day notice was running. In 3 weeks, the grain would stop. The cattle would need feed she could not afford, the whole delicate system tipping toward collapse, unless she could make the reclaiming of that fence line the least of Garrett Thorne's problems. She did not want revenge. She wanted leverage. There was a difference, and she had thought it through, carefully lying awake tracing it out. A man cornered by his own wrongdoing is a man who has to come to the table, and a man at the table can be dealt with. A man merely humiliated only wants to hurt you back. She was not trying to destroy Copperline. She was trying to make Copperline need her, which was a harder and more useful thing. She made a list in the notebook of everything she still did not know. Whether the county acted on citizen complaints or only on its own findings. How long an investigation took. What a company that size owed on paper for the grain it produced, and whether that number could be checked against where the grain went. She did not have answers to most of it. But a list of the right questions she was learning was itself a kind of map, and she meant to walk every line of it before the 30 days ran out. On the last Saturday before she meant to take everything to the county extension office, Cyrus Deal found her at the feed store one more time, not knowing what she carried in the folder under her arm. "Heard the brewery's cutting you off," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his gloating. Now the pity a man feels for a thing he always knew was doomed. "Shame, you put in real work. Just picked the wrong thing to build on. Beer trash was never going to hold a farm up." Wren tightened her grip on the folder that held 2 years of a company's carelessness written in her own patient hand, and she gave Cyrus Deal the smallest smile she had ever given anyone. "You keep telling me I built on garbage," she said. "Turns out the garbage remembers everything they did to it. It's all written down." She walked past him to the truck, and Cyrus Deal stood in the lot with his mouth slightly open, not understanding. The way people who decide the ending never do understand the pages still being written. That night she laid the folder on the kitchen table beside the blue notebook, the clean record beside the honest one. 2 years of quiet attention gathered into a shape that could stand up in a room full of adults who would want to make her disappear. Della sat across from her and put a rough hand flat on the closed cover, not saying anything for a while. When she finally spoke, her voice had recovered the steel it had lost the night on the porch. "Your grandfather used to say the meek inherit the earth," she said. "He never mentioned they had to fight the loud ones for the deed first." Wren almost laughed, the first almost laugh in weeks. She looked at the folder, at the notebook, at her grandmother's weathered hand resting on 2 years of her life, and she felt the last of her fear burn off into something harder and cleaner. Monday morning, she would drive with Della to the county office and set it all down in front of people who had the power to act. And once she did, there would be no unsaying it, no going back to being small enough to overlook. Somewhere east of the fence, Garrett Thorne was counting the days until a widow and a girl folded quietly the way small people were supposed to fold. He did not know that the smallest person on the Ashford property had spent 2 years learning to read the truth in dirt and water, or that she had written every word of it down, or that the thing he had thrown away had been keeping a record of him the whole time. On Monday, it was going to speak. Monday came up gray over Muskogee County, the kind of overcast that presses the horizon down close, and Wren rode into town in the passenger seat of Della's truck, with the folder flat across her knees, like something that might blow away if she loosened her grip. She was 14 years old, and she was about to walk into a room full of adults, holding 2 years of a company's carelessness in her own handwriting, and she found that her hands were perfectly steady. The fear had burned off somewhere back on the county road. What was left was purpose, cold and clear. Beside her, Della drove with both hands on the wheel and said nothing, which was her way of saying everything, and once at a stop sign, she reached over and squeezed the girl's knee twice, and then put her hand back on the wheel. The county environmental office was a low brick building beside the courthouse, and the man who received them was named Harlan Voss, a compliance officer with reading glasses pushed up into thinning hair and the tired patience of someone who fielded a great many complaints that came to nothing. He expected Wren could see another boundary dispute, another neighbor feud dressed up as a grievance, the kind of thing that ate an afternoon and ended in nobody satisfied. Then Ellis Ward, who had driven in to meet them and to vouch for the science but nothing more, set the folder open on the desk, and Wren began to walk Harlan Voss through her own notebook page by dated page in a voice that did not rush and did not waver. She showed him the nitrogen spike from the 1st April, the small question mark she had drawn beside it before she understood what it meant. She showed him the oxygen crashes in the downstream pool 3 weeks every spring, timed to the heavy runoff. She showed him the margin note about the sour smell rising off water where no grain belonged. She laid the rainfall logs beside the creek readings, so the correlation stood up on its own, needing no argument from her. And she pointed out where she had anchored her own dates to the flood that closed the county road and the freeze the paper had reported so that nothing rested on her word alone. Harlan Voss stopped being tired somewhere around the second spring's data. He took his glasses down off his head and put them on, which is what a certain kind of man does when he realizes he is looking at something real. "You logged all this yourself," he said, turning a page carefully as though it might tear. "Over 2 years without knowing what it was." "I logged it because it was true," Wren answered. "I didn't know it was important. I just knew it was real." It was the plainest statement of her entire method, and something in the way she said it made Harlan Voss look up at her over the rims of the glasses, seeing for the first time not a child with a complaint, but a witness with a record. That was the moment the machinery of consequence, which had been sitting idle for 2 years, quietly began to turn. The investigation did not move at the speed of a girl's urgency. Voss explained that the county would have to test the creek flats independently, pull permits and manifest from Copperline, establish that the dumping was both real and unpermitted. It would take weeks. Wren did not have weeks. The 30-day notice was still running. The grain deliveries still counting down toward the day the cattle went hungry. She understood, walking back out to the truck under that low gray sky, that she had lit a slow fuse on a problem that was moving fast, and that she would have to survive the gap between the two. Della, reading her face, said only that they would feed the cattle on savings and prayer if it came to that, and that the girl had done the hard part, which was the true part. Wren was not sure the hard part was behind them. She was fairly sure it was not. What she did not know was that Harlan Voss, once roused, moved faster than his warning suggested. He had spent a long career watching small operators poison the ground and drive off clean, while the paperwork lagged behind them. And here for once was a case that did not depend on his catching a truck in the act. A case already documented, already dated, handed to him by a child who had done his job for 2 years without being asked. Copperline's manifest, when the county pulled them, did not account for the grain. The math was simple, and damming a brewery that size produced a known tonnage of spent grain, and the amount documented as spreads sold or hauled to permitted sites fell short by a wide margin year over year. The missing tonnage had gone somewhere. Wren's notebook told them exactly where, and the county's own creek samples, when they came back, told them she had been right down to the season. Garrett Thorne learned that his company was under investigation, not from a girl or a widow, but from a certified letter of his own, and the reversal of it must have tasted like iron. The man who had sent a polite notice to reclaim a fence line found himself facing state water quality violations, potential fines that dwarfed anything the grain arrangement had ever saved him, and the particular public ugliness of a regional brewery caught poisoning a creek to save on hauling fees. The redirection deal he had signed with the larger agricultural firm, the deal that had made him decide to cut off a widow in the first place, suddenly looked less like a savings and more like the thread that had unraveled everything, because it had put a new set of eyes on his tonnage right when the old arrangement went sour. He had reached for a little more money and pulled the whole structure down on himself, and the worst of it, the part that would keep him up at night, was that the record that hanged him had been sitting in a farmhouse drawer the entire time, kept by the very people he had decided were too small to matter. He came to the Ashford property himself, not with a clipboard this time. It was a Thursday afternoon when the unfamiliar sedan turned in off the county road, and Wren watched from the barn as Garrett Thorne climbed out, no longer pressed and certain but rumpled at the edges, a man who had driven a long way to a place he did not want to be. Della came to stand beside her granddaughter in the barn door, wiping her hands on a rag, saying nothing, letting the girl who had built this stand at the front of it. That was Della's gift, and she gave it deliberately. She stepped back so that Wren would stand where she belonged, at the center of her own reckoning. It cost her something to do it, to hold still, while a grown man walked toward a child of hers with trouble on his face, But she had learned by then that the surest way to shrink the girl was to step in front of her, and she would not do it. Thorne's opening was smooth, the reflex of a man used to talking his way level. I think there's been a misunderstanding that's gotten out of hand. He began spreading his hands. These things, once an agency gets involved, they take on a life of their own. I'm sure we can find a way to make everyone whole here. Withdraw the complaint, and I'd be more than happy to reconsider the delivery arrangement. Keep the grain coming. Forget the easement business entirely. He was offering her exactly what she had wanted a month ago, and he was offering it as though it were a gift rather than a retreat. Wren understood the shape of the moment precisely. He thought he was negotiating with a girl who wanted her grain back. He did not understand that the grain had stopped being the point the day she read the pollution in her own handwriting. I can't withdraw it, she said. It's not mine to withdraw anymore. Once the county tested the water, it stopped being about me. But that's not what you drove out here to hear, so I'll tell you what I think you actually came for. She watched him recalibrate, watched the smoothness falter as he realized the child was ahead of him. You have more grain than you know what to do with, and now everybody's watching where it goes. You can't dump it. You can't hide it. And the firm you signed with only wanted the clean part. They don't want your problem, they want your product. So you've got tons of a thing you have to get rid of legally in public with an agency counting. She let the silence do some of the work before she finished the thought, because she had learned that a true thing lands harder when a person is given a moment to feel it coming. I built the only thing that turns your problem into something legal, she said. Composting, feed mixing, a documented permitted use for every ton you can't account for. The county isn't going to let you dump it anymore, but they'll let you send it somewhere it gets used on the record exactly the way I've been using it for 2 years. You don't need your fence line back. You need me. You just drove out here thinking it was the other way around. That was the pivot of the whole afternoon, the moment the ground finished shifting under Garrett Thorne for good. He had come to buy off a complaint from a girl. He was being offered instead a lifeline by that same girl on the condition that he stop treating her like something to be managed and start treating her like the only exit from a room he had locked himself into. The elegance of it was that she was not lying, not bluffing, not overreaching. She was simply describing the situation more clearly than he had let himself see it. His grain had to go somewhere lawful. She was the somewhere. You want to make me a supplier, he said slowly, the words coming with difficulty, a man tasting the exact size of his own reversal. I want to make you a partner, Wren corrected. On paper. A real contract, not a note you can cancel with 30 days and a clause. You deliver the grain to a documented composting and feed operation mine at a fair rate that covers what it cost me to process it. The county sees a brewery that found a responsible outlet. Your fine gets easier to argue down when you can show you fixed the thing instead of just getting caught at it. And I get a guaranteed supply I don't have to beg for. She paused, and here the steel came up under her voice, quiet but unmistakable. The difference is this time I'm not the one who can be cut off. You are. Della, standing back in the barn's shadow, watched her granddaughter turn a man's own cleverness inside out and felt something she had not felt in the long, grinding decade of holding 12 acres together, which was the sensation of watching a burden lift off and land fully formed on shoulders strong enough to carry it. She did not step forward. She did not add a word. This was not her victory to share in, and she knew it, and the knowing was its own deep satisfaction, better than any word she might have said. Garrett Thorne looked out across the pasture, then at the fat cattle on land his grain had helped restore at the green strip along the south fence, at the girl who had assembled his ruin and his rescue out of the same blue notebook. He was not a stupid man, only a careless one, and carelessness meets its limit the moment it costs more than it saves. You've thought about this more than my lawyers have, he admitted, which was as close to surrender as men like him come. I've had 2 years, she said. You had 30 days and you spent them writing me a letter. The contract took the better part of a month to draw it properly, and Wren read every line of it herself before she let Della sign, because she had learned exactly what a single overlooked clause could cost. She read it the way she had once read the letter at the mailbox, slowly mouthing the harder words, hunting for the trapdoor, and this time there was none, because this time she had been the one at the table when the words went down. The grain would come documented, at a rate that turned her operation from a survival trick into a business with a supply line she controlled. Copperline settled its violation with the county paid a fine, smaller than it might have been precisely because it could point to a working remediation. And the story that might have ended a widow and a girl instead ended a brewery's bad habit and started a girl's enterprise. Cyrus Deal, when he heard the shape of it at the feed store, said nothing at all for once, which was the loudest thing he ever said about her. What followed came the way real growth comes, which is to say, not in a single triumphant leap, but in a steady accumulation of mornings. With a guaranteed grain supply and a contract behind her, Wren stopped rationing her ambition. She bought 4 more acres from a couple down the road who were retiring out of farming, the wife pressing Wren's hand at the closing and telling her the land was glad to go to someone who'd listen to it. She hired her first real help, a high school boy named Hollis Rourke, who needed the summer wages and had the kind of hands that made hard work look unhurried, and she trained him on the drying screens and the moisture ratios herself from the blue notebook, because the notebook had become a manual without her ever meaning it to. He was older than she was and took his instruction from a girl without a flicker of complaint, because within a week he had seen that she knew every part of the work by heart and would not ask him to do a thing she had not done herself 100 times. The feed mix went from 2 customers to 11 farms spread across 2 counties, drawn not by advertising, but by the plain evidence of cattle that gained in soil that came back. Wren kept her prices fair and her records exact, and the exactness that had once been only a private honesty became the foundation of a reputation. Men who had laughed at the barley girl now drove out to buy from her and did not mention the laughing, and she did not mention it either, because she had learned that the best answer to having been underestimated was simply to keep being worth more than they had guessed. A second barn went up white against the sky, the way the first one was, and the south field that had been cracked red clay when she was 13 tested when the county lab ran it as healthy topsoil, the kind of ground a person could hand down. Through all of it, the grain kept arriving at the fence line. The same fence line, except now it came under a contract that named her on terms she had written from a company that had learned the hard way what she was. Which is why Garrett Thorne stood at the Ashford gate that Tuesday morning in late September, 2 years and some months from the first steaming load, no longer a man arriving to settle a debt, but a man arriving to look at what his carelessness had accidentally grown. He walked the property for 45 minutes, and Wren walked it beside him without saying much, letting the place make its own argument. He counted the cattle and got to 63, every one of them heavy and bright-eyed. He met Hollis and 2 other workers at the mixing station moving through a routine so smooth it looked easy, which is the surest sign that it was not. He stood a long moment in front of the soil certificates framed on the equipment shed wall, the county's own lab paper testifying to what the land had become, and he did not say anything because there was nothing a man in his position could say that would not sound small. At the end of it, he turned back toward the fence line where 2 years of deliveries had come and gone, searching, it seemed, for words that would let him leave with some of his dignity intact. "We almost stopped it all last spring," he said finally, "before any of this. I looked at the arrangement and thought that widows probably going to complain about the smell one of these days cost us more than it's worth. I nearly killed the whole thing over a complaint that never came." Wren looked out across the pasture at the animals grazing on ground she had raised from the dead at the barns and the green field, and on the porch of the faded house, her grandmother standing with a hand shading her eyes, a lifetime of stubborn labor, finally standing on the far side of its reward. "The grain didn't build this," she said, and her voice was quiet and certain and carried further than any shout. "Everybody had the grain. Half the county had grain rotting on a fence somewhere. Paying attention built this. That's the part nobody wanted because it's the part you can't have delivered by a truck." Garrett Thorne had no answer for that, and to his credit, he did not try to manufacture one. He got into his sedan and drove back down the gravel, the same drive he had first come up expecting to manage a small problem, leaving behind a thing that had outgrown every small idea anyone had ever had about it, most of all his own. Wren watched the dust settle behind him, the way she had once watched it settle behind Ellis Ward, except that this time she was not testing a fragile new hope to see whether it would hold weight. This time she knew exactly what she was standing on, because she had built it ton by documented ton, and no letter in the world could reclaim it now. Wren walked back up to the house where Della waited on the porch. The 2 of them stood together looking out at the operation in the slanting light, not needing to narrate any of it, because they had never been people who narrated their victories any more than their kindnesses. Your grandfather would have liked to see this, Della said at last, her voice gone soft at the edges. He always said the land pays back exactly what you put in, only slower than you'd want. She put her weathered hand on the girl's shoulder, the same hand that had once rested on a closed notebook the night everything nearly came apart. He never said it'd send a girl to do the collecting. Wren almost smiled. She thought about the pile of steaming waste she had refused to look away from, about the flashlight nights, and the failure she had underlined twice about the boy at the feed store who called her a name that no longer fit anyone. She thought about how the whole county had bent over something valuable for years and never once seen it, and how the only thing that had ever separated her from them was that she had stopped to look. Success had not come from finding something new. It had come from seeing worth in the thing everyone else was paying to throw away, and having the patience to prove it one dated page at a time. She was 14 years old, standing on land that was hers to keep now, and she had already learned the thing that most people never learn in a whole life, that the world is full of value, lying in plain sight, dismissed and dumped along fence lines, waiting for the one person stubborn enough to pay attention. The waste had remembered everything. She had simply been the one willing to read it.